I'm Travis Brown, founder and CEO of Mojo Up Marketing and Media. And this is my podcast where I talk to the most successful Black and brown business executives who've broken through the barriers of today's business culture. Welcome to Mojo Up Live. My name is Travis Brown. I'm super excited to be back with you again for another great podcast. But today, I got a special friend, somebody that I got to know over the last couple of years here, and I'm excited to bring you Andrew Adeniyi. Not only has he been an executive, but he's an entrepreneur and works in the DEI space himself. Please welcome my man, Andrew.
Thank you. Appreciate it. It's an honor and privilege to be here.
I got to jump out the gate and ask you this question because you had an opportunity to work in one of the greatest cultures in America, Starbucks. You worked your way up in executive leadership, but you left. Mm-hmm. So talk to me about why did you leave Starbucks to do what?
Yeah, so why did I leave? It's a loaded question, but number one, I always knew that I wanted to be a full-time entrepreneur. It was just a matter of when. I grew up with two parents from Nigeria who were both entrepreneurs my entire life. So I really think it's embedded within my DNA. The timing became much more clear though, because I'm a man of faith and I believe God put a couple of series of events in my life that led me to believe that life is short, so X. And most of the time people say life is short, then they go back to doing exactly what they're doing before. That didn't sit well with me. So for me, I filled in that blank with I'm going to chase my dreams. And my dream was to add value, to inspire others to be the best version of themselves. And I was fortunate to find that intersection of what I'm really good at, what I'm willing to work at every day, and what the business world needs. And that's providing culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting and training.
We're going to dive into that, but I want to go back because you have an interesting connection between your education because you went to the place down south of Indianapolis area, and then you also went to Michigan State. How did those two things happen?
Yeah, so for me, I grew up in South Bend, Indiana, so right down the street from Notre Dame, but that was a little too close to home for my liking for college. So I started looking at other really good business programs, and IU is one of the best in the country, especially for public universities. 4 hours away from South Bend, so distance-wise, it was perfect for me. I was also supposed to be a preferred walk-on at IU Bloomington for football. So the business school combined with the ability to play football was why I initially was drawn to IU Bloomington. I ultimately hung up the cleats and decided not to play and just pursue business entirely. But Michigan State came because I didn't want to take the GMAT. I took it, it whooped my butt, but I was persistent on getting an advanced degree, and Michigan State had a program where you didn't have to take the GMAT in order to get in, and it was 100% online. So I was able to work full time. That time I was working for an international retailer, and I could do my education as well. And they're one of the top ranked schools for that master's that I got as well. So just happened to keep it in the Big Ten. So go Hoosiers and go green.
Hey, like I said, interesting combination. But you mentioned a couple things. One, family and being a man of faith. So talk to me a little bit about your role as a husband and a father, and how is that shaping how you live and how you do business?
I'm still figuring it out, to be honest with you. I'm still figuring it out.
That's probably the best answer right there.
Yeah, I would say what I've learned though is boundaries and parameters are super important. So for example, I don't work after 5 or between 5 and 8, almost, never. I like to leave that time open for family to be present. On Saturdays, from Friday night to Saturday night, I don't work at all. Now, Sundays I'll work. Sometimes after the kids go to sleep, starting at 9 p.m., I'll get some additional work done. But that was one of the first things I put in place to ensure as this entrepreneurship life ramps up, things get hectic, things get crazy. How do I ensure that I'm not letting work bleed into family and home life too much? From a marriage perspective, things like therapy, ensuring that we're having time to be intentional with working on us, as well as date nights. Those have been some of the things that I've tried to lean into heavily, just to be able to balance everything and make sure I'm not putting too much energy and focus on work and giving the leftovers to my wife and kids.
I love that you mentioned, a lot of that, but one of them was therapy. I think, on this show, I sit down, I found basically 80 plus Black and brown executives and business owners. And, one of the things I think that we struggle with sometimes in our own community is being willing to get help before it's too late. I'm just kind of curious because I've been kind of transparent that my wife and I, we go, quarterly. I go personally, quarterly or even sometimes more often to seek that type of counseling / therapy. What's that experience been like for you, and what do you think it's done for you personally and maybe even your marriage?
It's been transformational, to say the least, to have somebody who's unbiased, to be able to hear you, for you to be able to feel heard, feel seen, feel valued, but for them to also be able to shoot it straight to you and let you know some things that you need to hear, has just been transformational for me personally, because I also do personal therapy typically once a month, sometimes twice a month, depending on how stressful things are going.
Right.
And then from a couple standpoint, we continue to do that alongside that. So, it really fills my bucket in a few different ways. It helps me become more self-aware. Mm-hmm. It allows me to connect some dots from my childhood and how I see the world and how that influences the people around me, mm-hmm. that otherwise I wouldn't be able to connect those dots because I would have the blinders up. Mm-hmm. So it's just allowed me to have that third-party person that allows me to feel heard, feel seen, feel valued, but then also to give me some critical feedback.
Mm-hmm. You talk about your parents being from Nigeria.
Mm-hmm.
How does their heritage, how has that impacted you and how you operate day to day in the world that we currently live in?
Two things: work ethic and education. My parents are the only people from their family who made it to America. And not only did they make it to America, but they're doing very well for themselves. And, upper middle class, for sure, and have just done outstanding things. And a lot of that is work ethic, working their way to a position where they're able to even get to the country. And then another thing that they credit is education. So my father has a PhD, my mom's working on her PhD, I have an older sister who has a PhD. So education has just been ingrained in our brains and embedded in our hearts and minds as this is the key, one of the keys to success, or to increase the likelihood of success. So I would say seeing them come from, the village in Nigeria, a very rural area, right, where poverty is crazy through the roof, from a statistical standpoint.
Yeah.
Seeing how they've been able to leverage education and hard work to get to where they're at is something I carry with me every single day.
Mm. I think it's interesting when any of us look at our parents and we think about what things that they taught us to do more of, and what things that we've decided that, man, I don't ever want to do it like that, right? My mom always takes it personal if I don't do things the way she did. I'm like, no, this is just evolution, right?
Yeah.
So as you think about your life, what your parents have provided for you and the opportunity, so what are you trying to prepare? What are you trying to provide for your kids?
A safe space for them to engage in dialogue at home. So both of my parents left their parents at a very early age. My dad around 12, my mom in her early teens as well, and never lived with them again from that point on. Mm-hmm. So they didn't grow up feeling what it was like to come home and see mom and dad here and to have conversations about how school going and some of those things. And because they didn't have that, they didn't do a good job of fostering an environment at home where we could just sit in the living room as a family and chop it up and talk. And I didn't realize that was as big of an issue at the time, but as I have gotten older, I realized that, hey, I'm not as comfortable facilitating those conversations at home because I never saw that. I never experienced what that looked like. Whereas my wife, on the other hand, they would talk all the time. That was very common. So in terms of what I don't want to do that they did was not create an environment where my kids aren't opening up and sharing and being vulnerable at home. I want to change that for sure.
One thing that we do, and I had a very similar experience where I grew up in a single parent home with my mom, and although I spent time with my dad, like I didn't have that same, you come home from school, you have that type of feel. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we do with our kids, just when yours get a little bit older, but we do the question game at dinner. Mm-hmm. And it's there's one or two ways. It's either what would you rather, and then they ask you, would you rather do this versus that? Or what's your favorite? And we actually have a stack of cards that are on our kitchen table, and we do it. In fact, I was working late one day, and my wife and kids were having dinner without me, and they called me on FaceTime to include me in the would you rather.
I love that.
So it's just an easier way just for you to think about, to potentially help foster those conversations, as you start to build that tradition. So as you're moving from, this salaried, safe space of being an employee to entrepreneurship. So what's that journey been like thus far?
It's been a roller coaster. you've probably seen the memes and the images and people explaining what entrepreneurship is like, but it's a roller coaster. I mean, my last week in corporate America transitioning into full-time entrepreneurship, I had 2 clients who wanted to go in a different direction and scale back our agreements. Nothing that had to do with me or the work I was providing, but I just thought about the timing. What a coincidence that last week within corporate America, I'm already experiencing it. So it got off to a start where it's like, okay, I'm really in it. This is the downs that people talk about. But then on the flip side, I realized you're one email, you're one conversation away from your business being on a whole nother trajectory. And
good or bad.
Good or bad, right? And I've been fortunate to have a lot of connections that I know that will produce fruit eventually. It's just the timing of how do you continue. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges I'm learning is how do you balance working on your business versus working in your business? Because there's still work you need to do to continue to exceed expectations and produce good value, but you also need to work on growing it, which means getting outside of your business and meeting with folks and figuring out how you can network to scale your business.
Yeah, it's a constant battle as from an entrepreneur side of it is, especially when you're early on, you're in that solopreneur, when you are either the only one really doing the work in your company or you have a very small team where everybody is maxed out. Right, we've gone through that, in many different phases, here as well, and trying to figure out when do you work on that. And for years I worked in the business during the day, and I worked on the business at night. Yeah. Because during the day often you're in the grind, you're having all these conversations, and you're returning emails and phone calls and meetings, and then there's that side of it that's like, oh, well, now I have to actually manage all of that, and then you're sending those late emails. But I will tell you one of the things that I had somebody remind me, and it's something kind of I already knew, and we still don't do it well here at Mojo Up, is constantly staying in business development mode. And when you work in your calendar and what you're doing, being very aware of how much time you're spending towards business development, so you can build this long-standing pipeline of all the opportunities that will come at some point in time. Because that's the cool thing is when you get so many opportunities sitting there, you don't get stressed out when one goes away or one downgrades or one just disappears, because you have more. So definitely in that business development. But if we go to the heart of what you're doing, and you talked about culture. What's the philosophy that you have or you operate when it comes to corporate culture today?
Well, I think for one, you got to define it, right? And people look at culture a lot of different ways. In my book, The Circle of Leadership, I define it as the unwritten yet commonly shared set of beliefs that guide behavior.
So, say that again real slow.
Yep, the unwritten yet commonly shared set of beliefs that guide behavior. And the reason why that's so important is because when you're in business, you're trying to get results. The way you get results is through behavior. So if you can influence behavior, which that's what culture does, you can influence results. And that's probably the most simplistic way that I like to articulate the value of culture and the impact that some of the intangibles that make up culture can lead to the bottom line. So I would say that's how I define it. And could you repeat the question? I want to make sure I answer the second part.
Well, it's really just is what are you doing? What's your philosophy on culture?
Okay.
The way that it is here in today's world.
Yeah. So, number one, understanding what it is and why it's important. My other philosophy is trying to be intentional with the time you spend towards elevating and or creating your culture. So I like to always talk about the 80-20 rule, the 80-20 principle, right? Where if you can find a way to have 20% of your time dedicated to X, that could lead to about 80% of the results that you may be looking to find. So from a culture perspective, that could be as simple as check-ins with your team. The first 15 minutes of an hour-long team meeting. How do you build culture through that? Sending emails or recognition or happy birthdays or handwritten cards. Anything that positively influences the behavior of your team is something that builds culture, in my opinion. So having leaders be intentional with what that looks like is something I'm always trying to preach to the clients that I work with.
I think that's some couple great examples right there. And I think we've done a good job at some periods in our time really working on those things. And then other times you're like, I missed that, or I dropped the ball on that. But that's definitely a great reminder. But when you talk about culture, it's not just regular culture, because there's a spin that you're kind of focused on in the DEI space.
Yep.
Kind of unpack that a little bit for everybody Like, what is that? Because some people aren't as familiar and really understand what DEI is.
Yeah. So I look at DEI as a subset of culture. Culture is the larger umbrella. One main lever within culture is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And really, the goal of any good DEI strategy in the workplace is to get diversity of thought and foster a sense of belonging, right? So a lot of times we talk about diversity, but I always challenge leaders to think about, well, why do you want diversity? Is it because you know it's important and you need to do something about it? Do you truly understand the value of it? Because the value is diversity of thought. If we have 5 Andrews sitting around a table or 5 Travises sitting around a table, that's not good for business. And there's studies that continuously show that. You need people who have different experiences, different backgrounds, approach problems in a different way that allows us to minimize the blind spots that could be available when we're trying to make a decision. That's what diversity is. It's really trying to get diversity of thought. You know, when I think about a sense of belonging, if you have a good culture, people are going to be engaged, they're going to be more productive, and they're going to feel a sense of belonging. I like to say that when you have DEI in place, you are creating an environment where when Sunday night hits, people are not shitty about going to work Monday morning because it feels like it's a part of them. They feel like they truly belong in that organization and they're a part of it. And that's what DEI does and should aim to do at any organization.
You know, with all the talk around culture today, is this new? I mean, do you feel like it's new that people care or are concerned about really building their culture? Because I feel like it's something that's always been around. I mean, like if I go back to my junior high or high school days, which are a long time ago, and all those teams were about building culture. And, you know, first job, they didn't talk about it, but like everybody wants to be in a great culture. So why is this such an important conversation piece all of a sudden?
Well, I think there's a couple of things at play. If you think about over the last couple of years, right, where people have coined the Great Resignation, you have people realizing that, hey, I don't have to work here. I don't even need to work in this industry. Hey, do I even want to go to work? Do I work remote? If I do work remote, what companies offer me that remote? And it just allowed people to sit back and think about what do they truly want from their workplace. And because of that, I think culture as a category as a whole has elevated because it's made people stop and think, well, what is our culture? Not what we say our culture is, right? We're not talking about aspirational culture. What is your actual culture today? And I think the pandemic forced people to stop and define that and look at that. And they started to get data that helped them realize that a lot of people didn't align with the culture that exists in certain organizations. And that was a big reason for why people left. So I think that was a big component of it. And then specifically with DEI, the George Floyd murder. I mean, that was really the big domino that led to a lot of people saying, hey, let's reevaluate how things are within our workplace, specifically through the lens of DEI, which again is a subset of culture.
But what's the correlation between that and having diversity, equity, and inclusion in your company?
Well, when you think about culture, right, you're talking about people who are engaged, employee engagement, people who are committed. You're not going to be committed and engaged somewhere that you don't feel like you can belong. When you think about Starbucks, and one of the things that makes them so special is they want to create the third place. Meaning if you're not at work, you're not at home, they want you at Starbucks. Well, there's certain things that have to be in place for you to view a certain location as the third place. People may need to know your name. You may need to feel comfortable there. You may need to feel like you're welcome and you belong, right? That's culture. And Starbucks has been able to do that. It's a main reason why they've been so successful today, right?
What would you say is a secret sauce or secret ingredient to the Starbucks culture?
They're very clear on their purpose and they amplify it every chance they get. I'm getting ready to do a culture building class with True You, which we're both affiliated with. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is the importance of amplifying purpose. So for example, you know, probably every email I saw the CEO send out to the organization in my time at Starbucks, at least the mission or a core value was listed in every single written email I ever saw.
Interesting.
If there's ever a video broadcast, an interview, it was always tied in. So they did a really good job over communicating why we're here and what our non-negotiables are and what our purpose is. And I think when you have that, it's easier to attract the talent you want because you say, hey, this is what we're creating here. If you're not on board with this, it's not going to work for you. And a lot of times companies skip over the purpose or think they have their purpose nailed down, but it's really an aspirational purpose. And then people get there and they're like, wait, this is not what I thought it was based on what you shared. I thought it was innovation was a core value here, but we can't even fail here without, being scrutinized. There's a disconnect. So they do a really good job of their purpose first and foremost.
And as you're working with companies now, kind of bringing some of that background and thinking about culture, like where does a company start? Because you've used this verbiage a couple of times, the difference between what it really is and aspirational.
Yeah.
And I think every company has some level of aspiration to understand like where I'm going. So how do you transition, without it being a negative, I guess?
Data. I always encourage organizations leverage data and storytelling. It starts with data, right? So you have to get quantitative and qualitative data. So how do people perceive the fairness in the organization, the opportunity for growth? Do they feel a sense of belonging? How engaged and productive do they feel? So getting some of that data is super critical, but then also roundtable discussions and open town halls to say, hey, we want to get your thoughts, your feelings, your perspective on where we're at and where you think we're going, because we want to create a future with you in mind, right? And using that data, getting a team of people together to review that and then figure out what's the path forward. Regardless of where you're at in your journey, I always recommend starting with data because it becomes easier for you to create long-lasting goals that are achievable, but also challenging goals that will actually move the organization forward.
So where does it? So organization starts with data and doing that. If a company doesn't get culture right, what's on the other side of that?
Turnover, a culture of fear, disengagement. And when you look at the Gallup polls, majority of organizations are not getting culture right. So we've been talking about culture for however long we've been talking about it, but people suck at culture, right? 2/3 of people hate going to work. They hate going to their job. Not like mildly dislike, but like actually hate it. So when people hate going to work, you have people who are going to be actively disengaged and sometimes even sabotaging the organization slowly but surely because they're not happy. They don't feel a sense of belonging at work. So that's the other side of not doing culture right. But what I think happens is leaders are easier able to focus on tangible things, the email that comes in, this deliverable, this task. It's easier to quantify that. With culture, it's the intangibles. Hey, I just worked 14-hour shift for you and you didn't even say thank you. Or, hey, my wife just had a baby and you all didn't send a care package to the house. You didn't acknowledge that I just spent 4 years with the company. I didn't even get an email. Those little things, those can easily be overlooked, but that's actually what makes the difference the most for people.
Before we do our last little segment here, which is a hot seat, which I got some rapid questions I'm going to throw at you. So what is the opportunity for companies out there that know this is a struggle, they're trying to figure it out, and the opportunity to work with you? What does that look like?
Yeah. Number one is really just initial consultation, just for me to get an idea of where are you at within your journey. And then from there, it's being able to understand what are some of your initial goals, objectives. A lot of times they may not know that either, or they think they know that, and I have to help clarify. But I like to at least get that initial information. From there, it's as simple as me drafting a proposal, sending a proposal over of this is how I think we should attack the work. We align on the proposal, have an agreement, and we get started. So it's really consultation, proposal, contract from a logistical, tangible perspective. In terms of the actual work itself, again, it's going to start with data. So I'm going to go in and have a senior data consultant who's a lot more talented at data than I am. And we're going to craft some custom surveys for your organization to extract that information. We're going to set up roundtable discussions and focus groups to figure out what's the actual sentiment around the data that we collect. So we like to collect the data first, then have these discussions to say, hey, we see that only 60% of the organization feel like promotions are fair within the organization. Any context on why you think people may have scored it that way, and then see if we can get any anecdotal feedback and just commentary around some of the data that we get. And then from there, it's really just working with a team internally to craft some goals based on the data we collected, and we work alongside a team internally to help accomplish those.
Well, I think it's awesome because so many people need that and they recognize they can't do it themselves. So to have somebody like yourself that can come in and walk through that, I think is amazing. We've obviously been in a piece of that, had you in talking to our team as well. And we definitely appreciate that. All right, so last thing is the hot seat. I'm going to throw you a question, and you'll give me a 1-word or 2-word simple answer. Okay. It'll be somewhat painless here. All right. Favorite place to vacation?
Florida.
Coolest city that you've been to?
Denver.
Favorite restaurant to eat at?
Peterson's.
Favorite chain restaurant?
Favorite chain restaurant? McAllister's.
Favorite brand?
Nike.
Favorite sports team?
IU Hoosiers. Basketball team.
Favorite. I was gonna say favorite college next.
Favorite college? Hoosiers. Gotta stick with the Hoosiers.
No sentiment towards Notre Dame at all.
I'm a Notre Dame supporter, but they're definitely third place behind my Hoosiers and the Spartans.
Favorite TV show?
Shark Tank.
Favorite movie?
Batman.
Favorite kids movie you have to watch?
Favorite kids movie I have to watch? Vivo.
When it's all said and done, and you have these 2 numbers and you have a dash in the middle, what do you want them to say about Andrew?
I want them to say that Andrew used all his talents, skills, and abilities to impact people in a positive way, and that Andrew served as an inspiration to many and helped them be the best version of themselves.
Well, very well said, my friend. We're out of time on this segment, but man, I appreciate you stopping by. Love all the conversation about culture, and just can't wait to see all that you're able to do.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And hold on, we got to get the little clapper real quick, because I realize it's probably sitting back there.
Yep.
And all right, just hand it right to him. We're live, right? You just get the one clap, it's a wrap.
Go ahead.
Yep.
Wow.
Uh-oh.